John Curry, who was a distinguished former president of Northeastern. And John Curry got me into college. He was my, and Billy Mishkin's, and his wife Judy's guidance counselor at Swampscott High School in the fall of 1971. So, and he's written two terrific self-published novels, some pretty good dirty parts in it. So I urge you to take a look at those. And I don't know if President Curry is around very much, but he's a wonderful guy and had a big impact on me, and I know on many others. So I'm going to talk to her until I get bored with myself, I guess. And then we'll have a conversation about whatever you want to talk about. I have prepared some stuff. And so we'll go. And can you hear me? I mean, I have this, I was born in Salem, I have that kind of Elmer Fudd accent and stuff. It's a miracle I got married. Anyhow, in 1835, during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a short story, the details of which every New Englander should know. It involves a family living in the mountains, and the action starts when an avalanche begins. This avalanche rolls onward and right toward the modest homestead that they lived in, and in their distress and panic, the family ran from the house, only to be overtaken themselves by the rocks they were trying to avoid, while their home itself remained unscathed. Now, this story has its basis in an actual event that happened, as it turns out, 190 years ago, about 130 miles from here, in a lovely corner of New England called Crawford Notch. I'm sure you've been there. Now, you may know this story as the tale of the Willie Slide. Nathaniel Hawthorne titled his fictionalized version, The Ambitious Guest. And that's a long introduction to the notion that New Hampshire, hosting here, spent the fall playing host to two very ambitious guests. Hillary Rodham Clinton and Donald Trump were almost permanent presidents in my home state now of Pennsylvania and a bit north of here in New Hampshire. But not just there. These two ambitious guests, along with their campaign surrogates, were continually in Florida, Ohio, and North Carolina. The rest of the country was a campaign desert, right here. You didn't see Mr. Trump or Miss Clinton there at all, and you didn't see them here. That, of course, is the result of how the peculiar United States electoral college system, which forces candidates to win individual states rather than a countrywide popular vote, shapes the race to the White House. So let me tell you the entire campaign in a 30-second summary. You might call this the tale of two brothers. One of these brothers is a fellow named Frank Lucchino, who has senior status as a Pennsylvania judge, a friend of mine. He also has a home on the west coast of Florida. He grew weary of the campaign advertisements at his house in Florida, and then he went to Florida, where he found the same ads. And the other brother in this tale of two brothers is Larry Lucchino, who many of you know as the retired president and chief executive officer of the Red Sox. He hardly saw any of the campaign. He lives here in Massachusetts, deep Democratic blue. In the last 7, now 8 consecutive elections. He was a sturdy power center here for Mrs. Clinton, who went to Wellesley College, not so far from here, and who was vacation in Martha's Vineyard for years. So the U.S. presidential campaign came down to a very few states that were saturated with advertisements and candidate visits, while about 4/5 of the states were virtually ignored. Indeed, just as the general election campaign formally opened in September, 4 campaign planes were sitting on the tarmac of Cleveland's Hopkins International Airport. One was Mrs. Clinton's, one was Mr. Trump's, one was Tim Kaine's, and one was Mike Pence's. They were all there in Ohio, which, as you know, became a very important state. Together, New York and California account for 84 electoral votes, a little less than a third of the 270 you need to win the White House. California is the home state of 2 relatively recent presidents, both Republicans, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. But California has voted Democratic the past 7 elections in a row, now 8. New York, which elected Mrs. Clinton twice to the Senate, has voted Democratic the last 8, now 9 elections in a row. Now, these 2 megastates, which account for 57 million people, were so safely Democratic that they were not in play at all. The candidates went there from time to time for sleep, Mrs. Clinton to Chappaqua, Mr. Trump to Manhattan, or to raise money, perhaps in Orange County, for Mr. Trump, Manhattan, and Silicon Valley, for both of them. But there were no rallies, in Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Anaheim, San Diego, Fresno, and Sacramento. In the sprint to election day, the candidates had no time for states, even the giant ones, that weren't competitive. And that was a lot of them. Fully 2/3 of the states voted for the same party in the past 5 consecutive elections. They were pretty much off the itinerary. Most of the country was off the itinerary. But virtually the entire presidential campaign was conducted in fewer than a dozen states. New Hampshire was one of them. 40 states are larger than New Hampshire, but was a swing state, as you know. And it's a particularly sore spot for Democrats. And Ralph Nader, who ran for president in 2000 as an independent candidate, Green Party, not siphoned off votes and almost certainly would have gone to Al Gore, the vice president would have prevailed in the election, and the contretemps in Florida would have been irrelevant. You would never have heard the phrase hanging chads. In 2016, Mrs. Clinton took the state with a landslide margin of 2,700 votes. Then, of course, there's Ohio, in part because it's so closely divided, and in part because of a curious political phenomenon that involves the Buckeye State. Here it is. You may know it if you watch CNN. No Republican candidate has ever gone to the White House without winning Ohio. That even includes Abraham Lincoln, the second presidential candidate for Republicans, who won it by 44,288 votes in 1860. Donald Trump was virtually living there, and he won as well. This candidate's also singled out North Carolina for special favor. Barack Obama won it in 2008, lost it 4 years ago. Donald Trump won it. It voted only Democratic one other time since 1968. Carter lost the state itself to Reagan. Trump considered it well within his reach, and he got it. Now, this campaign had several elements. I'm going to go through just a few of them. One is mobilizing the base. Ordinarily, this is the easy part, but the political base is what gives a campaign its stability and provides a safety net when things go awry, as they always do. But not this time. This was a campaign of stolen bases. Mr. Trump poached the blue-collar vote that has been the Democrats' bedrock since the New Deal, which began more than 3/4 of a century ago. Mrs. Clinton tried to do the same with the moderate Republican vote, the GOP mainstay that helped elect the party's past 2 Republican presidents, George H.W. 41 and George Bush 43. Then there's the racist card. We hear a lot about this right now. Bigotry is an accusation that was once tacitly banned in presidential campaigns, but it emerged this time as one of the great points of debate. Mr. Trump called his rival a bigot, and Mrs. Clinton did not veil her contempt for him as a bigot as well. She said that he was reinforcing harmful stereotypes and offering a dog whistle to his most hateful supporters. For years, Republican strategists tried to make inroads among blacks, who at one time were reliable Republicans. Moderate Republicans actually provided the margin of victory for both the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But since 1968, when Richard Nixon began his Southern strategy aimed at whites in the 11 states of the old Confederacy, blacks have redoubled their devotion to the Democratic Party, an alliance forged during Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. So when his perhaps his biggest political gamble, and it did not work, Mr. Trump undertook an offensive to win black support, only to find that his rhetoric was offensive to his target audience. He asked black voters, "What the hell do you have to lose?" Mrs. Clinton answered, "Everything." She actually answered that in a television ad in Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and North Carolina. But Mr. Trump was merely saying out loud what Republican strategists have been saying for decades, that blacks have been taken for granted, that the Democrats count on their votes to provide little in return. This was an argument particularly favored by Republicans close to Jack Kemp, a late representative from New York, who ran for president in 1988 and later served in the elder Bush's cabinet. Mr. Trump did not fare well among minorities in the end. He got 23% of the non-white college graduates and 20% of non-whites without a degree. But he did breach an important gap, party. This political season seen the most dramatic transformation of partisan assumptions since 1980, when Ronald Reagan drew legions of Democrats to his candidacy. And perhaps since 1936, actually, when Franklin Roosevelt's landslide victory over Alf Landon sealed a vital shift in the American political profile. The reason is this. Mr. Trump's appeal to blue-collar workers who sided with him in astonishing numbers fractured the Democrats' long-standing alliance with this voting group. He took advantage also of a geographical gap. Great changes in the geography of American politics are always happening, but seldom as stark as today. Now, West Virginia provides a dramatic example. Back in 1968, our friend and your colleague, the Democratic nominee, Michael Dukakis, easily carried the state with 52%. Remember that, 52% West Virginia in 1968. A quarter century later, 24 years, a quarter century later in 2002, another Massachusetts governor, this time a Republican, Mitt Romney, carried West Virginia with more than 62% of the vote. Dukakis, 52 Democrats. 24 years later, Mitt Romney, Republican, 62%, a higher percentage than he received in blue, blood red Alabama, Mississippi. Donald Trump won West Virginia with 68% of the vote. At play there, of course, was changing fortunes of coal and strong feelings about guns, both of which are to the Republicans' advantage, especially in the wake of Barack Obama's advocacy of gun control measures and Mrs. Clinton's comments suggesting that coal was dead. Then there was one other gap here, the authenticity gap. He had it, she didn't. No one doubts that Mr. Trump was an authentic character on the stump, too much so for some people's taste, while Mrs. Clinton seldom showed the raucous sense of humor and deep humanity that her longtime associates attest she possesses, but that others find difficult to believe. He was loose and she was tense. He shunned the briefing book, she devoured them. He had no filters, she measured every word. Overall, this was a huge Trump advantage. Now, a few final words on what this confusing campaign was all about. It was, at base, a struggle for the hearts of voters who were at once desperate to change and satisfied with their well-being. It was an electorate that was impatient with America's leadership, even as it was highly supportive of America's leader. The numbers bear this out. The YouGov Huffington Post poll showed that a solid majority of Americans want to take the country in a different direction. And a separate poll by Gallup shows that people believe that their lives have improved since Barack Obama took office. And Mr. Obama, as you know, has healthy approval ratings. So in short, this is the whole election in one sentence. Things are pretty good, but we have to change everything. Every presidential election is a decision point for Americans, a moment to declare whether the path the country is taking is worthwhile or whether to swerve. Great changes in our nation's direction came in 1920, when Woodrow Wilson's engagement-oriented Democrats were repudiated by Warren Harding and the Republicans who turned away from Europe and looked inward. And again, a dozen years later, when Governor Franklin Roosevelt of New York defeated President Herbert Hoover and promoted a much more interventionist role for Washington in the economy. Another major change came in 1952, with the election of General Dwight Eisenhower, and 8 years later with the ascension of John Kennedy. And again in 1980, as we mentioned earlier, when the country turned from the President Jimmy Carter to appear former Governor Reagan and his vision of supply-side economics could thrive. This debate about the state of the nation is the centerpiece of this campaign. And the debate seems to be miscast slightly. That Gallup survey I talked to you about plainly shows that Americans believe their standard of living has increased since Mr. Obama entered the White House. When he was inaugurated, 73% of Americans said they were satisfied with their standard of living. This year's figure is 80%. More dramatic is America's assessment of their expectations. When Mr. Obama took office in 2009, 42% said their standard of living was getting better. Today that figure is almost 60%. Moreover, more than 55% of Americans say they're thriving, the highest figure Gallup has found in the 9 years it's this information. Even so, the candidates clearly sensed a stream of discontent. They did the polling also, but the discontent this time was of an unusual character altogether. Writing in the conservative journal National Review, this is the only time National Review has ever been quoted on the Boston University. David French argued this month that the country in 1980 was primed for resurgence. A good president had only to create the right conditions for success. This time, he continued, our culture is weak, our politics are weak, our nation is far less sound, beset with cultural problems that lie far beyond the capacity of any politician to fix. And so it's ironic that at a time when the problems seem beyond the range of traditional politicians, two untraditional politicians were competing for the White House. The Trump campaign may have argued that Mrs. Clinton had the outlook and persona of a traditional politician, but as the first female nominee of a major party, she was by definition untraditional. In a Secretary of State, she emphasized global issues involving the role and welfare of women to an extent that no chief diplomat had ever done before. Mr. Trump, of course, I need not tell you, is the least traditional nominee of all time. All this is occurring as the profiles of the two parties are changing dramatically, undergoing important, perhaps lasting change, just as the country seeks change and experiences a general sense of contentment. Has there ever been such a confusing time? Now let's have a quick look at the 45th President of the United States, much as that is difficult for some of you to hear. He's proposed a wall at the Mexican border. He's described immigrants as criminals, rapists, and drug runners. He's questioned the heroism of a Vietnam prisoner of war who 8 years ago was the Republican presidential nominee. He's displayed unsettling preoccupation with the bodily fluids of women. He's prompted commentators and scholars from coast to coast and around the globe to say that America has never had a prominent political figure, never had a presidential candidate, never had a media magnate or a business magnate remotely like Donald Trump, except maybe we have. Flamboyant and unfiltered, Trump may not resemble any single figure in the American political tradition as much as he is a formidable combination of several of them, some from the left, some from the right, a mix reflecting his own political provenance and profile. There are echoes of some relatively recent presidential aspirants, from Ross Perot, the crusty cocksure business mogul, who promised in 1992 to fix what the politicians had broken. And there was Patrick J. Buchanan, the fierce congressional conservative, who delighted, just like Trump, in lashing the viceroys of the political establishment, and who terrified them by winning the New Hampshire primary in 1996. But there are also longer historical threads to trace. It's my conviction that the most riveting figure in American politics today can perhaps be parsed as one part populist, recalling in some ways William Jennings Bryan, one part brilliant exploiter of public figures, like Joseph McCarthy, one point mesmerizing but inflammatory preacher, like Father Charles Coughlin, and one part showboat, like Jesse Ventura, who was governor of Minnesota, plus one part crusading anti-elitist, Huey Long, governor of Louisiana, senator, and possible presidential candidate. In some ways, Trump, real estate developer, TV personality, presidential candidate, and now president-elect, perhaps most evokes the aura, though not the shameless corruption, of the early Huey Long, who was described this way by the historian T. Harry Williams in his classic 1969 biography of the man known as the Kingfish. This is T. Harry Williams speaking about Huey Long. Quote, "He excited people and he excited emotion, arousing in his relatively short but explosive career every feeling in the political spectrum: amazement and admiration, disbelief and disgust, love and hatred, and with many individuals, cold apprehension." But Trump is far more than Huey Long redux. His issues are contemporary: stagnant wages, terrorism, government, contempt of government, immigration. He's an angry warrior against what he paints as the blindness of the bland in American politics. And his persona is an amalgam, not as some analysts have suggested, even in recent days, of Marine Le Pen of France and the distempered voices of the populist right of Europe, but instead the anger of the back channels and tributaries of American history, all rolled into one campaign. He's outraged, like William Jennings Bryan. He's outrageous, like Jesse Ventura. He harnesses fears, like McCarthy. He's fearless, like Long. He takes advantage of economic unease, and yet he has an easy way, like Father Coughlin. And his persona is especially appealing to anxious voters, distrustful of politics and government. He's a man who projects absolutely no doubt about his ability to transform both of them. This much is real. Trump is a powerful force, perhaps an enduring one in American politics. 2 Americans out of 5 consider Trump's statements insulting and the wrong approach. But like so many predecessors, Trump feasts on a frustration that's very real. And it's a factor in a nation where, according to the Pew Research Center, the American middle class is now smaller than the nation's upper and lower classes. In this era of multiple public opinion polls, there is one remarkable thing that people agree upon. 2/3 of the American people believe, despite their own lifestyles, that the country is going in the wrong direction. And you don't have to be a professional pollster to understand intuitively that Americans' trust in government doesn't remotely approach the 77% it was recorded in 1964. Now, Trump matches his inflammatory and in some ways intoxicating rhetoric with a personality well attuned to the moment. Too rich to be bought by the big interests, too self-assured to be swayed by the party establishment, too blunt to be misunderstood. Trump candidacy in its early days was on the periphery, was a distraction, but he evolved into something quite different, something far more powerful. One of the reasons is his willingness to express the thoughts widely held but sparingly expressed. Another is his appeal of his rhetoric, which is effective, not nearly as eloquent as that of William Jennings Bryan, he ran for president 3 times. First time in the 1896 campaign, and he delivered that famous Cross of Gold speech. The poet Vachel Lindsay, who wrote an amazing poem about William Jennings Bryan, it starts Bryan, 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 the people. He said, when Bryan speaks, the sky is wide, the people are a tossing tide. Though a prominent German language newspaper at the time said that Bryan had a bombastic speaking style, he spoke like he was in a Methodist camp meeting. A third of Trump's attributes here is his proposal to ban Muslim immigrants, as you know, which extended the range of political argument but well beyond ordinarily acceptable bounds. In that he mirrored another earlier media star, the aviator hero Charles Lindbergh, who enthralled Americans until his anti-interventionism veered into anti-Semitism. Still another is the strange and undeniable auditory appeal of Trump, which is the angry postmodern analog of Father Coughlin, who I mentioned earlier, who was possessed with what Wallace Stegner called a voice so captivating that anyone turning past it on the radio dial almost automatically returned to hear it again. He sounded like, as Wallace Stegner said, a parish priest addressing crowds such as no man had ever addressed before. Final element, Trump's surpassing self-confidence, which matches that of Huey Long, whose sister once said, Huey felt he was a man of destiny who was put here for a purpose. Trump, for the entire campaign, held a commanding lead among voters for whom a strong leader is the most important characteristic of the nomination. In fact, when I heard on election day at around 1 o'clock that the exit polls, which weren't saying who was winning, said that the public wanted somebody who was a strong leader, I knew immediately he was going to win that election. William Jennings Bryan and Huey Long almost certainly never met, but Huey Long appropriated from Bryan a phrase that would become his legend. Every man a king, but no one wears a crown. The two pitched that appeal to workers and farmers, winning the opposition of the political leader of the time, both marked by economic distress. We've heard this also. There's this element of simplicity to the Trump appeal, one that echoes past political players from the left and right. So as this campaign wound down and now in its post-campaign era, Trump seems to be in a part of an American tradition. Richard Hofstadter, who wrote this famous book about the paranoid style of American politics, he died 45 years ago. He spoke of a sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy. Those were powerful forces in our tradition. But in a new book, just down the street at BU by Stephen Prothero speaks of the importance of worry and apprehension. Critical motivating factor in our politics, he said, is anxiety. Anxiety about loss, anxiety about the passing away of a beloved way of life. That may actually be at the heart of the appeal of Trump, as it was from the left for such figures as William Jennings Bryan and Huey Long, and from the right for such figures as McCarthy and Henry Ford, who himself once was considered a presidential prospect. Americans wanted to be relieved of their worry, their anxiety about loss and the passing away of their beloved way of life, or at least almost half of them did, because as we know, Hillary won the general election total votes. So it sounds like President-elect Trump is a brand new person with a brand new siren call, but it is as old as the Republic. His rise is fascinating all-American. But in his way, he is a fascinating all-American president. So I'm happy to take your questions, and if they're really hard, to avoid them.
Thanks, David.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Where do you see the future going for the next 4 years?
Well, it's hard to, the question is what's the future? And you can ask that question in many dimensions. Let me just choose a few ones. I think one of the, of course, the important question is what happens with his stewardship of the White House. We have no idea. Today, he released names of 3 people in his inner circle. They will no doubt trouble Democrats no end. Some Republicans, though not all. I think we can say for certain, though, that the long-term question of what's going to happen based on this revolution is what happens to these 2 parties. The Republican Party was the party of the elite, and now the Democrats are being described as an elitist party. The party of the establishment was the Republicans, and it itself has no establishment left. The Democrats were the party of the working person, blue-collar workers. They flocked to Trump. In my own state of Pennsylvania, he only won 3 areas. I mean, Clinton only won 3 areas. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia suburbs in Philadelphia, and Center County, which is where Penn State is. The rest of the state was red, blood red. So what happens to the profiles of these parties and what happens to the 2-party system is, I think, a long-term, very critical issue. I mean, America needs a strong Republican Party and a strong Democratic Party, and it has neither right now. And so the Republican Party has no idea. Is it the Trump Party? Is it the Paul Ryan Party? Is it the George H.W. Bush 41 Party? The Democrats, well, who are they? Elizabeth Warren, well loved here, and also Bernie Sanders. They are on one wing of the Democratic Party. Hillary Shirley represented another wing of the Democratic Party, which I think in recent days has been repudiated soundly. The Democrats do not want a presidential candidate who cozies up to Wall Street, gives $250,000 speeches to Goldman Sachs, etc. So, but who are the Democrats? And if you look at Nancy Pelosi, I think is over 80. Bernie Sanders just turned 75. Who are the Democratic leaders of the future? I defy you to name 4 Democratic governors, which is where parties usually get their nominees. I specialize in this, and I have a hard time. So who's going to be their candidate? So those are some of the questions that are unanswered right now that are swirling around. Yes, sir, back there.
I'm going to have to answer this question. How did the Electoral College come about?
How did the Electoral College come about? It was part of a great, huge package of compromises. I'm freelancing a little bit here, so for any historians who want to give me a mid-course correction, please do not hesitate. But generally speaking, it grew out of a distrust of mob rule, of public rule. You notice that when we created the Constitution, Americans didn't even vote for members of the Senate. They had the state legislatures until 1916 vote for the senators. Some states deviated from that, but there's a whole bunch of compromises that are implicit in the Constitution, many of which involved keeping power half a step away from the people, and many of them involving preserving the rights of the states, because the United States of America is, we don't think of it this way, it's a union of states. There's no, to this day, there is no one nation. It is a nation of 50 states. And in fact, until around 1840, when you spoke of the United States, it took a plural verb. The United States are going to war. The United States are a free trade nation. The United States are a slave nation. Today we say the United States is. The transformation of the United States from a notion that took a plural verb, the the notion that took a singular verb was a huge passage in our country. But the electoral college was created in that plural era where they wanted to retain power in the states, particularly the small states. Vermont wasn't here yet, but Rhode Island, Delaware, etc. And so the notion was, if you didn't do that, the big states would control everything, and nobody really, people looked upon Massachusetts and Virginia, and to a lesser extent New York and Pennsylvania, as basically the equivalents of the Yankees, to a particularly reviled object here. That they were the big guys, and so they wanted to give power to the states. So the Electoral College is actually a mathematical formation. It's the number of members of the House plus the number of members of the Senate. Of course, the number of members of the Senate is a constant too. But say take Vermont and Wyoming and Montana, for example. They have one member of the House, two Senates, thus 3 electoral college votes. So it's the number of House representatives, seats you have, plus 2. And of course, we reapportion those things every 10 years. How did I do on that, okay?
It was good. I thought you might also just go into the prospects of reform, and people who tend to not win in the Electoral College are very against it.
Right, okay, now, Dan just used the word I do not allow in my newspaper, reform. Because because reform connotes something is good. I don't allow people to say something is good. We're trying to be even-handed. So, the people who lose the Electoral College but win the popular vote, they think that getting rid of the Electoral College would be a reform. I don't think Donald Trump would feel it today that was a reform, nor would George W. Bush, nor would President Hayes. Although President Tilden, whom none of you know, would feel very, very, very well. Samuel Tilden was the governor of New York, who in 1876 won the popular vote but lost the election. The chances are 0.
Yeah.
Because the people who win elections are the people who are in office. And the people who can have the power to make the change are not going to make a change that would remove them from power. So I think you have a greater chance of being hit by a meteorite at Hippo Square than to have this, that's right, meteorite, than to have this thing change. In fact, well, I won't even go into those things. Go ahead. Yes.
So given that the power of the executive branch has grown since the New Deal, but especially over the last 30 years, and given that the Electoral College was in place, so our electors are actually picking our president and not the populace.
Right.
But the populace does actually send our representatives to Congress in the form of a legislature.
That's why it's a republic and not a democracy.
Right. So shouldn't we as people be more focused on reigning in executive authority and making our executive accountable to Congress, who are our elected representatives, our directly elected representatives?
Right. So you think you're offering a modern idea, but that is essentially the notion that was in the base principle of the Whigs in the 1830s and 1840s, who wanted to move power from the executive to the legislative. And of course, the Whigs in England felt that way, Parliament vis-a-vis the king, right? So, I have no idea what your politics are, but I do have an idea what you guys, as a group, your politics are. And you won't be able to tell from mine, because I'm really good at hiding. But, and basically, I just wanted to say that journalists, particularly editors, we are political eunuchs. Okay? We have no politics. Okay? I don't go to the primaries, not a member of a party. I'm an art critic. I watch it happen. Anyhow, I know, I can guess what, as a group, that you would fear the notion, as a group, this is this, you fear the notion of excessive is a bad word, of much executive power under President Trump. But the problem with your argument is going to be that these executive powers were expanded by President Obama.
Well, I'm a Republican, so I agree.
So well, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. Thoughts on both your houses. But so So, I knew there'd be one here at Northeastern.
Come on.
I'm already at Harvard, I know that. So those who are going to be, say they're fearful of Trump's executive powers, are going to have to come to grips with the fact that executive powers were dramatically increased under President Obama, including the right, particularly in foreign affairs, drones, all this sort of stuff, executive orders, etc. And so President Trump, President-elect Trump, who had a great time 10 days ago describing President Obama as a tyrant, essentially, using powers that weren't delegated to him by the Constitution, is now going to inherit those powers. Yes, I'll get to you next. Yeah.
It's great to see you here. I used to read you when you were at the Globe, so
You
it's
and my
good.
parents. My parents are both dead, so I'll give you a hug later.
Well, as a newspaper man and a journalist, I wanted to ask you, how do you respond to what's your response to the criticism that the media, do you feel the media did its job during the primaries and the general election, holding the candidates accountable, particularly Mr. Trump, and are you concerned at all with with any moves to give the president-elect to give his family official positions within the government?
Well, let's take the second part first, and I hope that everybody in the audience forgets that you asked the first part. When Senator Kennedy was elected in 1960, he appointed his brother as the Attorney General, and he said he thought he ought to give little Bobby a chance to work in the family before he went on his own. Congress did not like that and passed a law that President Johnson signed, saying that you can't do that anymore. So there are legal restrictions to that. This is a question when it comes up about his son-in-law. I mean, we all have to love a guy who loves his son-in-law. Those of us who are married, we know it doesn't always work. So, I think that whether he has an official position or not, he'll be, Kushner will be, influential. He has, he'll have the presidents here. Rosalind Carter was a very influential figure, so was Nancy Reagan. So too was Hillary Rodham Clinton, was still allowed to say her name. And so too was Mrs. Obama. Less so, of course, Laura Bush and Pat Nixon. So I think whether he has an official position or not, and he won't, I'm thinking, he'll still be an important factor. And you'll notice he closed down his newspaper the other day. Ordinarily we don't like when people don't. Oh, now I'm supposed to have to answer the other question. All right, so how did the press do? I don't know. What we do after elections is what we always do. We go to Harvard and have a conference and bring our hands and say, woe is me, and we sin and we'll do better next time. And then we say we won't look at the polls so much, and then we say we won't do the horse race so much, and we'll pay more attention to the issue, and then we're going to do the same thing 4 years from now. The difference here is the question about whether Trump had an unfair advantage because of his availability to television and radio, particularly cable TV. Of course, the obverse of that is why didn't Hillary call him on it? And the question is whether he got so much free press, he needed to spend so much money, and that he was so fascinating. Because, admit it, all of you guys, none of you guys voted for Trump except maybe you. You couldn't take your eyes off him. It was kind of like watching a car crash. In slow motion, you couldn't take your eyes off him. And I think cable TV knew it was fabulous ratings. And so that's the question, is whether, somebody who's there's such an appeal, whether it's a grotesque appeal or a positive appeal, commands such free attention that it warps the race. I don't think that Hillary Clinton is blaming cable TV for the loss. And I salute her for that, actually. I mean, she had a chance to call it. They would put her on, too. Let's talk for a minute about the polls. Everybody's saying, oh, the polls got this wrong. I don't love polls either, but I don't think they got this wrong. The polls said that Hillary was going to be ahead by three percentage points or so, but at the end, well, she beat Trump by 2 percentage points. Differences between within the margin of error. It's just that there was the margin went the other way, rather than the way everybody thought. So, if you looked at the Electoral College polls, you could have had a suggestion, but I don't think any of us who, well, first of all, let me say what my tribe does, okay? 2 days before the election, we always say we have no idea what's going to happen, and 2 minutes after the election, we say it was inevitable. I did it myself, okay? I mean, I had a piece in the Globe on Sunday saying this should have, not Sunday, saying this should have been seen. I didn't say that I saw it. I just said it should have been seen, right? So we always do this. We're experts, really, after the fact, and we don't know anything before the fact. And my wife, who's in the other room, hiding probably, says she'll never listen to what I say because I was the guy who said that told her that Gary Hart would be a 2-term president. I told Gary Hart that the other day in an email. He wrote back and he said, I should have been a 2-term president. I think I've answered your question, or at least I've evaded it so swiftly. I promised you next.
Yeah, my question is that do you see this result as a part of a wider trend globally that started with Brexit and well, actually probably started with the French elections last season,
Right.
then moved on to Brexit, then to Trump, and now probably the Italian elections and some other European elections will reflect an anti-corporatist move that is a global anti-corporatist move.
Sometimes a facile, simplistic explanation is true. And it may be. I mean, we won't really know for a while. I mean, we saw in the 20s and 30s what we now call the crisis of democracy. Spanish Civil War, Mussolini, Hitler, and other small-time fascist types. And we see some things happening here that may be a trend and may not be a trend. And it sure looks like it, but I don't know. We'll know in 10 years. Yeah, and we'll know actually after the French elections. And Marine Le Pen will probably get into the finals, but not win.
Well, the French system is structured to stop people like Marine Le Pen.
That's correct. She'll get 40% in the first round and 41% in the second. Yeah. Yes. Go ahead.
So, you evoked some very interesting figures from America's past and said you saw parallels.
Another example of how easy it is to see things first. Okay.
But in all of their cases, none of them came close to being president of the United States. And in fact, only Ross Perot even ran for president of the United States. So these were all populists who were, I mean, I guess McCarthy was not exactly outside of the system, but most of them were not people who were running for president of the United States. So I guess what I would like to ask is why at this moment were we willing to turn to someone who in the past, however powerful and influential these people were considered to be demagogic outsiders.
Right.
And why did we pick a demagogic outsider? Particularly at a moment, as you said, and I thought your crystallization of the election was very good, where people thought things were pretty good and wanted to change everything. It's hard to understand.
Well, in Fiddler on the Roof, there's a moment where there's a mini pogrom in Anatevka, and all the people run to the railroad station, and the rabbi's there, and they say, Rabbi, what's going to happen? He says, I will tell you the truth. I don't know. But I will say this one thing about Huey Long. President Roosevelt referred to Douglas MacArthur as the second most dangerous man in America. Now that begs the question about who the first one was, and everybody knows that he thought Huey Long was the most dangerous man in America. Huey Long was preparing to run for president in 1936. He probably would have run in 1936 had he not been killed. So I can call him a presidential candidate in a way, but you're right about the rest, that they never did emerge. I'm only a reporter, editor. I'm not the answer man here. I don't know why at this moment this happened, but I do know drove the entire length of the state of Pennsylvania on the Thursday before the election. And this is no scientific measure of anything. And I saw about 180 Trump signs and not one Clinton sign. Now, she was not speaking to a bunch of people in the United States. A lot of people think that the elites who run the country have done it for their own emolument, for their own self-aggrandizement. A lot of people think that they're left behind, or they're ridiculed, or their prospects for economic advancement have been stopped by people like Obama and Clinton, who want to stop coal mining and feel that dirty industries are bad. And so there's always been a strain of resentment in American politics, and also a paranoid style is often in American politics. I'm not arguing that people who voted for Trump were paranoid. So when you tweet that out, you also tweet that I said I did was argument. But I think that there's a sense of being outside, being left behind, and that particularly among Republicans who nominated him, Republicans had promised their constituents they would do X, Y, and Z, and they didn't do anything. So I think there's also an impatience with the political class. If you look at, of course you don't want to look at the ratings of the press, because we're down around 7%. But so is Congress. Congress is about 7% approval ratings too. When John Kennedy was elected in 1960, people thought, the rate of people, and I don't know the exact figure, but the rate of people who thought government would do the right thing most of the time was, I think, at least 65%. Now it's down to 28%. So it's just a general discontent, a general sense of frustration, a general sense of impatience, if not contempt, with political leaders. It's not new. It was the guy from Oklahoma, the famous political humorist from Oklahoma.
Will Rogers.
Pardon me?
Will Rogers?
Will Rogers. Will Rogers said that Congress was, maybe it was Mark Twain, who said that Congress was America's only native criminal class. We had this view for a long time, just now that everybody feels that way. But I can't answer the question. I don't know the answer to this. And I think there are going to be lots of books written and lots of PhD theses defended, but I don't really know the answer.
What about race?
Well, I think on the coast, people think that race was a big factor, and surely it was in involving Latinos. But I'm not sure that it was more than that. He polled a little bit better than Romney did among Latinos, but not particularly well. Clinton would have won the election had Latinos come out in a bigger number, and surely would have won the election had blacks voted at the rate that they voted in 2008. And they did. I mean, the vote in Philadelphia itself was like 100,000 short of what it had been, and I'm not sure that figure, but it was substantially short of what it had been in 2008. The Jewish vote for Clinton was down to 71%, the lowest in a long, long time. So a lot of those people did not come out.
You sort of just raised another point, but my initial point was about,
Could you speak up just a little bit?
you raised 2 points, but I'm just gonna, you touched on the media piece, but now you sort of brought in the racial piece. And you initially said that some of Trump's voters were, this is sort of an anti-elitist vote, and they wanted somebody who did represent that class, and he's actually from that class. So it's sort of frustrating to me to see that be the reasoning that people were saying that they were voting for him. He actually represents the very subgroup.
He embodied the thing that he spoke out against.
That he actually spoke out against. And it's just frustrating to me because I felt like the media could have
Do you
done.
teach here or are you a student here?
Oh, I don't know how to take that as a compliment.
It's a compliment.
I go to school here. Listen, I'm a student.
Okay. You're looking for your PhD thesis?
Yes.
Topic?
There you go.
There you go. I got you a thesis, I got another question. How's that? No, seriously, that's, I mean, you can answer that. There's another, like this, or yes.
How concerned should we be, if at all, about what the court will look at the Supreme Court?
Well, first of all, the question is about the court, how concerned we should be. I'll just say, I'll change it, how concerned should people be. Well, President Trump will nominate somebody for the Scalia seat. And so if this person is a devoutly conservative person, he or she will be less conservative than was Scalia. Think of that picture. But it's true. And it will, even if he or she isn't, is equally conservative, it can't be much more, then it will restore the balance of the court that preserved Obamacare and said that gay marriage was in the American tradition. So if you're worried about the court because you're worried about lounging rightward, I wouldn't worry for a while. I would make sure, however, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg gets a lot of rest. Well,
Before you
doesn't fall. We have a huge stake, if you're concerned about this, in Justice Ginsburg feeling really good. You can say the same for Boston's own Judge Breyer, Justice Breyer. So, in the meantime, in the medium term, I don't think much is going to change. For the long term, let's just remember that President Clinton, the real one, nominated to the federal bench Judge Trump, the sister of Donald Trump.
Third Circuit.
Third Circuit, right. Don't forget. This is all unpredictable. And don't forget, I was there, and I knew Judge Souter before he was nominated. And anyone who knew him knew that he knew exactly what he felt about me. But 45 Republicans, or more than that, 55 Republicans somehow didn't. But Judge Souter didn't turn out to be what everybody thought he would be, and neither did any number of other justices. Good question.
We were talking about, President Obama said he's handing over like the keys to the car. The country's in pretty good shape right now. Yet Hillary Clinton lost.
Any one of us as a parent who turned over those keys worries about the next trial.
So a lot of criticism, as you mentioned, has been leveled on Hillary Clinton because she gave those speeches to Goldman Sachs, etc. Imagine if Joe Biden, and this is a big if, had defeated Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination, which would have been tough considering she had all the money, endorsements, and stuff lined up behind her. But had he beat her, do you think he would have played in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and beaten Trump possibly?
We would be looking at the Biden administration, I think, is a good chance. Can't say for certain, but I mean, he would have won Pennsylvania as native state. He spoke authentically about, don't forget, he's the elitist too. He's been in the Congress, he was in the Congress Senate for more than 30 years. He's married to a woman who has the worst credential you can imagine if you're an anti-elitist, right? Some of you in this room have it. She's a PhD. He's part of the political establishment, but I think he would have been a good candidate. Yes, sir.
How concerned should we be about the appointment of Steve Bannon?
Well, Steve Bannon, I've read a lot about him in recent days. He's the most mysterious character ever to have a job like that, and surely the worst dressed. I think a shave and a trim would do well. But again, you never know. Anyone who asks that question, I think knows how he feels about this. And I'm an editor of a newspaper. I don't want to get involved in extreme comments one way or the other about something. I just don't think it's. I think we all have our thoughts about it, and we'll see how it plays out. Yes, sir. Oh, man. Excuse me, ma'am. I'm sorry.
What are your thoughts about the down ballot effect? And I mean that right down to the local level. Neither party seemed to be real concerned about what was happening way down the line.
And in
And
fact, let's go talking about fashion statements. Let me tell you what the great new fashion in American politics is. It's the Eisenhower jacket. Actually, you can buy the Eisenhower jacket. It's the jacket he wore on D-Day, etc. And you'll notice the Eisenhower jacket has no coattails. And the phrase emerged in 1954 and 1956, when 1958, when he ran and he was able in 54 but not in 56 to bring Republicans along into the Senate. So I think both candidates were wearing Eisenhower jackets.